barking a little bit. Okay, welcome everyone to Arlington Branch NAACP 7047 here in Arlington, Virginia, and we have a jam-packed hour for you, all things housing. I am going to go ahead and turn this over to Kellen McBeth, who's the chair of our housing committee, along with Brian Coleman. But again, I'm just the president. Kellen and them do all the hard lifting, the heavy lifting. And so with that, we welcome you. We thank you for being with us tonight. And Kellen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, JD. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight to talk about zoning and segregation in Virginia. So we are joined by two speakers from McGuireWoods LLP, who are going to talk about the report, part 2 of the report on zoning and segregation in Virginia that they released just a couple months ago, and its implications both for localities like Arlington as well as the Commonwealth of Virginia. So they, in this report, have done pretty extensive research into why our neighborhoods and our localities look the way that they do today, why we have the racial segregation that exists throughout, all of the Commonwealth today, as well as a number of recommendations both for localities and for the state on how we can help to overcome this legacy of segregation and its continuing negative impacts on members of the Black community. So just a quick introduction of our panelists. Matthew Weinstein is a land use attorney and zoning attorney with experience obtaining entitlement approvals in Northern Virginia with a particular focus in Arlington County. Matt has specialized in multifamily affordable housing projects in Arlington, including a 600-unit affordable housing project in Arlington that was a partnership between a leading nonprofit developer and a preeminent veterans organization. Outside of his land use experience, Matt has negotiated leases and license agreements and helped clients obtain ABC licenses. As a longtime Arlingtonian, Matt is actively involved in Arlington civic and political life. Thanks for being with us today, Matt. We also have James Dyke Jr. He has a broad practice that covers corporate, legislative, education, governmental relations, economic development, and municipal law. He previously served as Virginia Secretary of Education under former Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder, and as domestic policy advisor to former Vice President Walter Mondale. And so just to give everyone a quick rundown of our event this evening, we're going to start with a presentation from Matt and Jim, just covering some of the basics of the report. From there, we're going to move into a facilitated discussion, just going over a couple of questions, and then around 7:05 tonight, we're going to switch to audience Q&A. So I would ask that prior to that time, please stay on mute for members of the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or add it in the comments. And I will call on you or read your question to the panelists to have them answer. So if anyone has any questions at any time, feel free to put those in the chat. And myself or JD or Brian, my vice chair, or Wanda Younger, our secretary, will do what we can to respond throughout the event tonight. With that, Matt, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Kellen. Thank you, JD. We are very happy to be here tonight to present our Part 2 report and also give you a little more context from our Part 1 report. We kind of talked about the history of zoning and segregation in Virginia. So very happy to be here. And with that, I will launch into my presentation. And sorry, hold on real fast. Sorry. All right. Can you all see that? Good to go. Yep. All right, great. Yep. Well, again, my name is Matthew Weinstein. I'm a land use attorney from McGuireWoods. I'm joined by my colleague Jim Dyke from McGuireWoods Consulting. And we are here to talk about zoning and segregation in Virginia and the work we have done in our Part 1 and Part 2 reports. By way of background, this is our zoning and segregation working group. And the way we came together was back in March of 2020, not March of 2020, I guess it would have been around the summer of 2020, one of my colleagues and bosses, Jonathan Rock, following the death of George Floyd, invited a group of us to read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which is a great book on the history of zoning and housing finance and segregation. And out of that work group, we said, you know, we're going to really want to look at the history of this in Virginia. We're zoning lawyers, zoning planners. We want to really kind of learn the somewhat unfortunate side of our practice's history. So we formed in the summer of 2020, and then in 2021, we've released part 1. Before I do that, I'd be remiss to say if we didn't receive a significant amount of support from our firm leadership, including John Harmon, who's the chair of McGuireWoods. You know, we're the biggest law firm in Virginia, one of the 50 biggest in the country. And you know, it was wonderful to receive the support we did from the firm leadership when we put together part 1 and part 2. And John Harmon, he wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a little while ago, talking about his father's advice: don't hate, don't hide, don't be a victim. So with that kind of background, we use that as our, you know, our guiding light as we went through our report. All right, so the agenda for today will go through a summary of part 1, which is how zoning segregates economically and how it segregates racially. And then we'll talk about our part 2 report, which includes some local policy recommendations and also some state policy recommendations. So part 1 report was released in February of 2021. And we really focused again on the history of zoning and segregation in Virginia. And this is an example of a particularly odious ordinance that was passed in Ashland, Virginia in 1911, and essentially mandated the separation of the races in housing. And this is just one of many examples of Virginia at the time. And the genesis for this ordinance was Booker T. Washington wanted to create a school, primarily with African-American students in Ashland. So they passed a segregation ordinance to keep it from happening. And from 1911 to 1916, a number of localities in Virginia adopted racial zoning ordinances, including one of our neighbors nearby, the city of Falls Church, and then Roanoke, Ashland, Richmond, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. And you'll notice that, you know, Arlington isn't one of those localities. And, you know, the way segregation occurred in Arlington, one of the ways it happened was economically. It wasn't just, you know, a racial zoning ordinance. It was economically through redlining and also for the restricted covenants for many deeds for single-family homes throughout Arlington. So in 1929, the city of Richmond tried again, and they enacted a racial zoning ordinance relying on Virginia's anti-miscegenation law at the time. The US Supreme Court in 1930 struck down Richmond's ordinance in Richmond versus Deans. But the legacy that racial zoning created lives with us today. And a good example of that,
Matt, are your slides supposed to be moving forward or advancing?
yeah, can you not see them?
No, we can see your slides, but they're not advancing. So
Okay.
You may want to go down to that caret on the bottom for screen share mode. We see display settings, 1, 2, 3, 4, go like 4 over and click there.
Sorry.
It's okay. We were getting some people were not seeing the slides advance.
Okay. I'm sorry. So I go to share screen. You said it's there?
Yeah, go ahead. Just share screen again.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you know when it comes up.
Okay.
All right. So so down at the bottom of your PowerPoint, there's a caret. It looks like you see these 4 squares, very bottom.
Mm-hmm.
All right, go over 1, 2 over.
Mm-hmm.
One more, right? Click that slideshow.
Okay. Can you see me advance through here?
Yeah.
Like this?
Go ahead and click it. Go ahead and click it.
I
Let's see
clicked.
what happened. You
I
clicked
clicked it. Yeah, I clicked it. Can you not see it now?
No, it didn't go. So you're going to have to manually move to the next slide.
Okay. Well, how about this? I just won't do a slideshow.
There you go.
See
That
it?
worked.
There you go. There you go.
That worked. There you go.
Yeah.
You just, yep.
All right. So where did I lose you?
They're now seeing the Ashland segregation ordinance.
Okay. All right. So anyway, so this is the Ashland ordinance. And this is the Booker T. Washington news story about his school. These are the localities where racial zoning ordinances were adopted. This is what happened in Richmond. And then importantly here for Arlington, this shows the legacy of segregation and zoning in Virginia. So this is actually from a presentation the county put together a little while ago. In the crosshatched area are areas of the county where 70% or more of the population is white, non-Latino. And the yellow areas are the parts of the county that are only zoned for single family housing, meaning that the only housing that can currently be built in these areas, in these zoning districts, single family housing. So there's a lot of overlap between parts of the county that are predominantly whites and parts of the county that are zoned only for single family housing. And again, Arlington did not have an explicit racial zoning ordinance, but through decades of redlining and restrictive covenants for deeds that prohibit selling property to anyone who was not of the Caucasian race, resulted in this. And another offshoot of this was the lack of generational wealth building, because African Americans could not buy homes in Arlington for the most part. They couldn't build wealth through home ownership. And over the decades, that made it harder for African Americans to buy land and property in Arlington. And obviously with housing prices being as high as they are now, that is still an ongoing problem. So, we highlighted the problem in February 2021. That was the easy part. And then in May of 2022, we finally released the hard part, which is some of our recommended solutions to solve this. And we don't think there's one size that fits all, really. There are a bunch of ideas that have been floating around for many, many years about how to increase housing equality and housing stock in Virginia. And we kind of throw some of these ideas out there for local and state policymakers to discuss. So local recommendations, including here in Arlington, we recommend that every locality include housing equality in a comprehensive plan. So comprehensive plans are the overall guiding documents for localities in Virginia. They need to be updated with some frequency. And we're saying that every comprehensive plan should include a chapter or a section on housing equality. And a good example of this actually was in the city of Roanoke, where they had 3 priorities dealing with neighborhood choice. And they talk about how Roanoke needs to identify and remove barriers to housing choice. They said that the city needs to understand the connection between finances, housing, and literacy in order to remove barriers for vulnerable people in the city. And then support the concept of greenlining, and then developing affordable housing options in each neighborhood and avoiding displacement where possible. So Roanoke is a good example of other localities are doing, and we think every other locality should have something similar to this. Second local recommendation is to update zoning ordinances and maps to encourage mixed use with higher residential density in existing commercial areas. Arlington is largely doing this, especially in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor and also down to National Landing in Pentagon City. But most localities aren't. And we work with developers, of course, in McGuireWoods, and very often development is, to make development feasible, it is a math equation. They have to make it work financially. And the way to do that in many instances is to allow enough density to make it worthwhile. And if there's enough density, then there's gonna be additional housing units, rental or ownership, to help really increase housing equality in any given locality. The third recommendation is to offer affordable housing incentives using density bonuses, parking reductions, and tax abatement. So in Arlington, again, we're largely doing this. We don't do tax abatement, but we do offer bonus density for providing on-site affordable units, parking reductions as well. But these bonus density and parking reductions only come through what's called the 4.1 site plan project in Arlington. And those are the big redevelopments you think of when you see any new building in Roslyn, Ballston, or National Landing. And that process takes a year and a half, costs many millions of dollars. And often when developers go through that process, because it's time consuming and costly, they will pass the cost down onto the renters. So that's part of the reason why rents are very high in Arlington. It's because the cost of getting these projects approved get passed down to renters. So we're doing some of this in Arlington, but we're not necessarily focusing on home ownership units, condos, other forms of housing like that. But we are doing a lot better than most localities. This one's not particularly relevant for Arlington, but we recommend adopting proportional proffer guidelines for affordable housing. Other localities other than Arlington have what are called proffers, where you offer some contributions to help mitigate a project, but there are no real standards to really determine what should be proffered and what shouldn't be, and how much you can expect to really contribute. So this isn't relevant here because we have what are called site plan conditions, but in other localities, this is important. And then the fifth thing localities can do is to promote greater home ownership for low income and moderate income households. A lot of what people focus on is affordable housing in the rental sense, whether it's an affordable housing project that's done through what's called a LIHTC project through the state. We're not really focusing on affordable home ownership, which is very difficult in an expensive place like Arlington. But one idea we highlight in our report is our community land trusts, which is really a way for people to get involved and get some equity from home ownership through what's called the ground lease. There are no community land trusts in Arlington, in part because land prices are so high, but it is something we recommend going forward in having the state and localities think of ways to make these economically feasible. This one may be familiar to some of you in the audience. We recommend adding missing middle housing types to residential zones. Most of you, again, are very familiar with this in Arlington, but it's really adding different housing types into areas that are currently zoned exclusively for single family housing. Duplex, triplex, fourplex. The county right now is considering up to an 8plex in some single family zoning districts. But again, Arlington is well ahead of the curve compared to most places in the state. So we're all familiar with what we're doing here. And I don't think missing middle is going to solve every issue, but it is, I think, as an Arlingtonian, something that's very important to me, that we increase housing availability and housing stock to the people here, so more people can live here affordably. And then the seventh recommendation at the local level is to have other localities coordinate regional housing supply to the extent they can. No locality is an island. People move from Arlington to Alexandria, Fairfax to Loudoun. We're all in the same boat together. And while localities only have jurisdiction over their localities, they can coordinate regional affordable housing goals, use best practices, things like that, to really try to address this from a regional level, rather than just specifically for one locality. And then we also make some state policy recommendations, this being what is called a Dillon rule state, meaning that if the General Assembly passes something, essentially that applies to every locality and really the state rules. So it is very important that the state legislation really address this as well, because that's going to be at least the most effective and direct way to impact most localities in Virginia. The first one is to amend state law to require comprehensive plans to measure and address housing inequality. The state already does this for a number of priorities in the code, and really it would just call on localities to address housing equality through their comprehensive plan updates. So this is kind of in tandem with the first recommendation we made at the local level. The second is to have the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development provide technical support to localities. So not every locality is as well-financed and sophisticated as Arlington. So they'll need help putting together draft ordinances, engaging community, and things that require a significant amount of staff time and resources that they simply don't have. So we recommend the VHDA help provide GIS and census data support, indices to measure racial and economic segregation, model ordinances, and education advocacy for increasing housing choices. And then the third recommendation at the state level is to reform state law to expand the use of inclusionary zoning. And that is essentially allowing for bonus density in exchange for providing affordable housing. Again, Arlington's unique. Arlington's ahead of the curve. We already have such an ordinance. We're already doing this. And that's part of the reason why you can get bonus density for providing affordable units on site for the major 4.1 projects I spoke about earlier. But again, that only applies to the major projects, doesn't apply to any by right development. By right meaning that you don't need special approval. And the fourth one is to require local zoning to allow accessory dwelling units in single family districts. Again, Arlington's already doing this. We're well ahead of the curve here. We don't see too many of them, but the county did amend its zoning ordinance in 2019 to make it a little bit easier to have ADUs in single family zones. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it over to you for some last minute thoughts and overarching comments.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt, and that was a great presentation. First, let me thank the NAACP for providing this forum. I've got a long history with the NAACP. My uncle used to be the president of the DC chapter of the NAACP, and when I worked in the White House with the Vice President Mondale, did a lot of work with the national NAACP and have been engaged with your various chapters across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And a lot of the progress that has been made and the leadership that's going to come for us to address these problems is going to come from the NAACP. We're standing on your shoulders in some of these areas, but it's very important that you get engaged and help us move in this direction. As was mentioned by Matt, we put this report together as a result of our firm's effort to try to address racial justice issues after the murder of George Floyd. And as was mentioned, the color of law was a great inspiration for us to do this project. And I've seen already a couple of references in the chat room about how great a book that is. And if you have not read it, I would urge you to take a look at it. It's a terrific, terrific write. For me, this is a real personal issue because 50 years ago, when I was a third-year law student at Howard University, I wrote my law journal article on an issue called the use of zoning laws to keep poor people out of suburbia. And the reason I mention that is that it's 50 years later, and a lot of the recommendations that we make in this report mirror things that I was talking about 50 years ago, which is symbolic of the fact that our country has not acted aggressively to address these issues. And that's why we think now is the time for action, and we want to hopefully get this discussion started so that everybody is involved and engaged in moving this ball forward. Also, on a personal level, I've experienced discrimination in housing in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So using the Virginia term, I've got a dog in this fight, which is why I feel very passionate about the issue that we're doing. The starting point for what we did when we put this report together is the well-documented and unacceptable wealth gap that exists between white and Black Americans. Per the Federal Reserve Board, the median Black net worth is approximately 1/8 of median white net worth. This did not happen overnight. It did not just sort of drop out of the sky. It was the result of a legacy of oppressive, racially motivated governmental policies at the federal, state, and local level. And as we looked at this gap, this wealth gap, which was sort of the underpinning here, the two pillars for building wealth are education and home ownership. And Virginia's record in both of these areas, as far as denying Black access and equal treatment, is morally reprehensible. First, with respect to education, Virginia had a history of segregated schools where they basically said Black people would go to one set of schools to the extent they existed, and whites would have the support of public schools. When that was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, instead of saying, well, all right, let's do the right thing and move forward, what did Virginia do? It adopted massive resistance and said, we're going to close the public schools rather than go forward. And what happened as a result of that was obviously the opening of the achievement gap between our various students. So Virginia's record in education, which is one that, having served as Virginia's Secretary of Education, in fact, the first Black Secretary of Education in Virginia and in the country, is up close and personal to me, that we've got to address that issue as far as education is concerned. As it relates to home ownership, Virginia started out, as Matt talked about, having ordinances that basically made redlining the law of Virginia. And I did see a question earlier, redlining is basically just what it sounds like. They took a map and they used a red pen and they drew circles or squares and said, white people can live here and Black people can live there. And that was the redlining. And so when that too went up to the Supreme Court and finally was overturned, instead of moving forward to try to integrate our housing, Virginia moved to use zoning as a way of keeping segregation, housing segregation, alive. African Americans were unconstitutionally denied the means and the right to integrate middle-class neighborhoods. Because this denial was state-sponsored, as was said in the Color of Law, the nation is obligated to remedy it by taking aggressive governmental action. America's history of discrimination in housing has been continuous and consistent, beginning with General Sherman's post-Civil War effort to try to provide 400,000 acres to newly freed Black men, only to have that overturned by President Andrew Johnson, who instead gave the land to Confederate soldiers, people who basically had committed treason against the country. This is an example of the many governmental actions that have put white interest above fair and equal treatment of Black people. A couple of other examples in the sense of trying to move quickly. For many years, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration openly advised and advocated the maintenance of harmonious neighborhoods, i.e. racially and economically harmonious. And it also had a effect, some consequences. And let me just allude to a couple, just to give some examples and set the context. The fact is today, 90 degrees outside, it's really hot. One of the consequences of housing discrimination is that because the Black neighborhoods basically were paved over with highways or had factories, a lack of tree canopy, studies have shown, and I think the Gilpin Court in Richmond was one perfect example, that the temperature in those neighborhoods were 5 to 20 degrees hotter than in other parts of the jurisdictions where whites were living primarily exclusively. As a result of that, it caused related health issues like asthma and diabetes and high blood pressure, all of which was compounded by the recent COVID situation. So that's one of the consequences of us having this segregated housing. And why part of the discussion now is how do we address that? Another example had to do with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which basically jumps into action when there are hurricanes and federal disasters. Well, one of the problems is, especially in the South, when you look at areas like that had the Ida and the Katrina hurricanes, a lot of people had their property damaged. Well, how did that impact the Black community differently? Well, because of the fact that Southern states did not allow Blacks to participate in the legal system, we did not have deeds to property. And the only way you could recover going through FEMA was to be able to display a deed to show ownership of property, because most of the property in the Black community passed through what is referred to as heirs law, which is basically passing from one person to another. They weren't able to document the fact that they owned the land. And as a result of that, a lot of the land was basically taken away or not supported in the Black community because they could not show those deeds, a direct result of a racist legal system. It's also reported that many of the lynchings in the South were related to white efforts to take Black-owned property. I'm pleased to see that FEMA has taken steps in the last few months to try to address that problem of deeds and being able to establish ownership in order to recover areas of funds when you lose property. Other examples, though, as we talk about land use, and Matt was very good in talking about that, one of the things in this we talk about in this report is that it goes beyond just zoning laws. It has to address other issues if we're going to deal with this in a comprehensive way. Just want to give you a couple of examples of something you might want to focus on. For example, financial access, the fact that minorities have traditionally been excluded from having access to the funding needed to acquire homes. The fact is that the current use of the credit scores and the things that go into making that up have not reflected the lifestyle of minority communities. And as a result of that, you find that the minority communities are paying more as far as mortgage insurance or having to pay higher interest rates in order to get homes to move forward. So that means we've got to get the banking industry engaged in this to make some significant changes to open up those opportunities for home ownership. Also, as it relates to the real estate community, because of practices of not showing homes to everybody on an equal basis, we've had a lack of opportunity for minorities to go look at homes in all neighborhoods that are available. That means the real estate industry is going to have to step up and address that issue, and we need to be putting pressure on them to do what is necessary. But I also want to make the point that we're not here basically just to blame people or to point fingers. What we're trying to do is figure out what do we need to do as a state and as a nation to address the vestiges of discrimination that still exist because of past racist governmental policies. And what we are trying to do is to develop a message to say we need to have more attainable housing available for minorities and everyone else, because that's something that we will all benefit from. Because when we create more attainable housing and open up more housing opportunities, it's not only going to help us address the vestiges of racial discrimination, but it's going to make attainable housing available for essential workers, for teachers, for nurses, for trade skilled workers, for first responders, for hospitality workers, for younger adults who have trouble being able to buy homes in the neighborhoods where their families are because they just don't have access to it, or there's a low inventory of homes. So this is a message that says if we address this problem aggressively, not only will minorities benefit from it, but our community as a whole will benefit from it. And it'll be a great economic development tool for the Commonwealth of Virginia. You're probably familiar with all the discussion about the fact that for 2 years in a row, Virginia was rated as the #1 state in the nation by CNBC for doing business. And two of the reasons why had to do with workforce preparation and also a welcoming attitude, a welcoming environment. Well, one of the things that's part of a welcoming environment is to be able to make sure that everybody has access to equal treatment. And even though we were doing some of the right things, as Will Rogers said a few years ago, being on the right track is not enough. If you're not moving forward aggressively, you'll still get run over. So we need to address these things aggressively. Also, I want to note that when we talk about CNBC and the ratings, just a few days ago, it came out that Virginia had dropped from #1 to #3. And #1 now is North Carolina. 2 points here that are relevant to this discussion. One of the reasons that they said North Carolina had moved ahead was because they had set aside partisanship in order to support economic development. That's a very important point here in Virginia. And I know my friend Larry Roberts from the Sorensen Institute is one of the people listening tonight. And we have joined the Northern Virginia Chamber has joined with the Sorensen Institute to begin a program to address the question of civility and bipartisanship in getting solutions and resolutions to problems facing Virginia. So it's very important that we realize this is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue, it's a Virginia issue, and we all need to work together to make it happen. The second point about that North Carolina designation was that one of the problems that Virginia is facing is that we're having an out-migration of people from Virginia to other states. And it noted that a lot of them are headed to Charlotte and to Raleigh because they have a greater inventory of available, attainable housing, and people have a better opportunity to buy a home. That is something that says to us, if Virginia is going to stay competitive, we have got to look for creative ways to make housing more attainable for everybody and to make it more available. So that's something that I know your organization can play a powerful role in trying to do that. It's also the business community, and part of our report references the fact that the Virginia State Chamber of Commerce, in its Blueprint 2030, when it talks about the things that are needed to be done to grow our economy, one of the big issues is we have to focus on providing more workforce housing, more inventory, more attainable housing in the Commonwealth, so that people have a place to live, so that people who teach in one jurisdiction don't have to live 150 miles away because they can't afford to live in Arlington or Fairfax or whatever the jurisdiction is. This is something that will benefit all of us if we work hard on it. In fact, there was a discussion last week before the Virginia Housing Commission that talked about attainable housing in Virginia and that we needed to work hard to do that. And the final point I want to make is that what is also driving this issue is the fact that diversity is coming. If you look at the census reports from 2020, you will see that we are moving in a direction where we will be a minority nation by 2036. Well, that's already in place in some of the jurisdictions in this area and other parts of the Commonwealth. And that means we've got to learn to respect the fact that we are a diverse set of people. If you're going to do business in a global economy, you have to understand everybody. You have to respect other people if you're going to be successful. So the bottom line of all of that is that this report not only talks about trying to address racial injustice and ending racial segregation, but if we do this properly, the entire community will benefit from it. So that when we start making these recommendations and asking you to talk to your legislators and General Assembly members and governors about what they need to do, you can tell them that this is something that's going to benefit everybody, and we need to work together to get it done. So with that being said, let me turn it back over to your leadership to handle any questions that anybody may have about what we've discussed.
That was powerful. I think both you and Matt deserve a virtual round of applause.
Yeah, thank you. As we said, we've got a dog in this. We've got a dog in this fight, so I'm passionate about it.
Yeah, back over to you, Kellen.
Thanks, JD, and thank you, Matt and Jim, for that great presentation. I think powerful message. I think a number of the recommendations on the local side that you brought up in your presentation, and that's in the report, Matt, you had mentioned that Arlington has already taken steps to try and implement a number of these. And I think that's true that Arlington has taken a number of steps, but I also think Arlington has a very long way to go to address the still existing racial segregation in our neighborhoods. We still have significant disparities in life expectancies, looking at neighborhoods that have larger percentages of Black residents compared to white neighborhoods just, right next to them. We have significant higher rates of asthma and other medical issues impacting our neighborhoods that have higher percentages of Black and Brown residents. We have very heavily segregated school systems in Arlington. I think some have even argued are worse than they were, 50, 60 years ago. There's still a long way to go, even though we're lucky that, not lucky, I think it's the hard work of a lot of people who have pushed our county government to implement a number of these policies. But there's still a lot to go. I think one of the things that comes up often is that some of these tools take reform at the state level and from the General Assembly. And it was nice to see that a number of your recommendations for the state level changes were actually part of our legislative agenda last year and things that we had been pushing with our legislators. Unfortunately, all of them died in the General Assembly. The only two housing bills, one of which we had worked very hard from, crafting it locally to getting it through the General Assembly, was vetoed by the governor. What we've seen from our perspective is very little appetite from this administration to engage in issues of equity, to engage in addressing housing segregation within the Commonwealth in general. McGuireWoods is often said to be probably the most powerful lobbying firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia. What actions do you plan to take as an organization to push forward these recommendations and help build this change within Richmond and throughout the rest of the Commonwealth?
Well, I'll defer to Jim on this one. He's works with the lobbying arm. So go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, well, we're sharing this report with every member of the General Assembly. We've shared it with the governor's office, with his key cabinet members. And what we have to do is to indicate to folks that this is something, and that's why I made the last point I did make about this is bigger than just the civil rights issue. This has to do with growing Virginia's economy, creating more jobs, creating a better quality of life for everybody. So we will all benefit from that. And that's why we've gotten the business community engaged, because it can't just be us down there saying we need to do this. They need to hear from the business leaders And that's why I referenced the state chambers, including these things in its report. It's saying, if we want to grow our economy, we need to have more attainable housing. We need to have a better way of addressing the segregated housing that is existing in Virginia, because we will all benefit. And we get people registered and talking to elected officials and be willing to vote. That's what you got to do. I mean, when I worked for Walter Mondale, he says, Jim, I've met a lot of dumb politicians in my life, but I never met a successful one who couldn't count. So that means you've got to get out there and get people registered and get them to vote and to tell these people that they want action and that this is the reason why. But it's going to take the community at large. That's why I mentioned it's not just the land use lawyers. It's got to be the banking industry. It's got to be the real estate industry. We're reaching out to those industries to get them engaged. In fact, we've got a call coming up in the next few days with the CEO of Caldwell Banker to talk about what that industry can do and what they can do to take a leadership role in getting these kinds of changes that we've talked about. But it's going to take people speaking up and saying this is the right thing to do. But it's important to be able to anticipate where the argument's going to come from. You're going to have a lot of people with the NIMBY attitude, not in my neighborhood. That's why we talk about attainable housing. For better or for worse, affordable housing has a sort of stigma attached to it to a lot of folks. But when we talk about attainable housing and talk about the fact that we're talking not only about low income people having housing available to them, but our teachers, our nurses, our firemen, our policemen, all these folks will benefit by having more housing available, a larger inventory, and implementing the kinds of recommendations we're making. So it's going to take an all-out effort, but this organization has shown in the past that it knows how to raise its voice and to let people know what's wrong. As John Lewis would say, to make some good trouble. And we need that sort of effort right now in order to move things forward.
Hey, Kellen?
Yep.
We have a hand raised, but I want to get James and Matt's thought on something before we go into Q&A. And I appreciate you mentioning diversity is coming. And I think in that lens, that's why a lot of folks are just fearful. If you had to rack and stack, housing, education, criminal justice, all those issues, those core issues, that we, the NAACP, work on, where does housing lie right now for you as a priority? I know you're working on this issue now, and so is many others. In your opinion, where does housing land?
Well, housing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, housing to me is a top priority also, but it's not a matter of putting one above the other, quite honestly. As I mentioned, the way to build wealth is through education and home ownership. So those two clearly have to be at the top. Criminal justice feeds into that because that relates to the education system. We've got a pipeline that basically sends minority students into the prison system as opposed to into the workforce. You got an issue. So they all are equally important. But the underlying purpose, and I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I guess I am, is that if we do this right, and if we treat people equally and provide equal opportunity and prepare people to go into the workforce and be productive, we all benefit. So even if you don't believe what I'm saying in the heart of my hearts, there's one color that everybody agrees on, and that's green. And to the extent we can tie it into that, that helps us make the argument.
You got a couple of questions, Kellen.
Thank you, Jim. We'll start with a question from Nathaniel Green.
Hi, thank you both for your presentation. I wanted to actually pick up on that point and just ask about, there's been a couple of different points in the presentation. Sometimes we've talked about housing, making housing affordable, making it accessible. And then we've also talked a little bit about housing as a store of wealth. And I wanted, one or both of you to kind of talk a little about how framing housing in those different ways is kind of related, because I think in some ways those two framings can really be at odds here. And I think that they can butt heads a little bit. And we've talked about them kind of alongside one another. And from where I sit, I can't help but think that a great many of the NIMBYs that we're kind of talking about view their house as a store of wealth, which is why they take the position that they do and show up to county board meetings and resist efforts to change tooth and nail, because they have so much of their money and their wealth wrapped up in their house. So I guess I wanted to ask you to kind of explore the relationship between thinking about housing both as, something everyone deserves and needs versus a massive store of wealth, which is also a reality that we're kind of working with. So that was my question.
No, I understand fully. And home ownership, as I said, is one of the main ways of building wealth. And I think a relevant point to your question is the fact that Alexandria just released a report that looked at that question about whether or not your home values go down if you have more attainable housing, more affordable housing. And they showed that, in fact, not only did it not go down, but it went up. And so we need to be able to document that a little more in some other jurisdictions to show that if we do this right and you create neighborhoods that are opening and welcoming, and we've got more people able to buy homes, that we will all benefit. This NIMBY argument, I've heard it for many years, but the facts don't back it up, and we just have to counter those facts. And this report in Alexandria is a good first step, and we can certainly make a link to that available to your leadership so you can get a chance to review that. But that is a most recent action that I think would reflect that. But Matt, I'll turn to you if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jim. You said it very well. The only thing I would add is, I think the 2 points can work together, because you want to have people have opportunity and access to the very resource that allows someone to gain wealth through home ownership, right? If you have housing opportunity, housing access, it means this generation, next generation, the generation of that will be able to build wealth through owning a home. So, the people who are benefiting from owning a home right now and the wealth that's generated from that should also want other people to have the same opportunity. So I think they're all working together.
And I see somebody in the chat box put a link to the Alexandria report I just mentioned.
Kelly, you want to try to get through some of these hands because like Mary, John, and then Adam.
Yeah, so Mary, our colleague from the Fairfax NAACP and chair of their housing committee, you're up next.
You're muted, Mary.
You're muted.
Thank you, Kelly. Fairfax County published a report recently of some testing that was done both in the rental market, the lending market, the mortgage market, and the real estate market. Between the latter two were between black and white paired testers. And they found that in about half of the cases in lending and real estate, the black testers were treated differently than the white testers. And it was a fairly small sample size, but I'm following up on Jim Dyke's discussion about mortgage and real estate being another significant barrier to integrated housing. And we have some proof now, small proof, that it may be in fact happening as we speak. And we probably need to do some more testing to document it a little more. But my question is, what do you think in terms of using fair housing route, fair housing laws, fair housing enforcement to deal with 3 areas: the mortgage, the lending, the real estate steering, and the rental of apartments?
Yeah, no, your point is very well taken. And in fact, quite honestly, the Fair Housing Act does not address those things directly. We need to have some steps taken. That's why I'm saying we need to work with not only land use lawyers, but with the banking industry, with real estate. Everybody else has got to get engaged in this very, very issue, because it's going to take, for example, when you look at credit scores, which are used to determine risk insurance or mortgage or what have you, some of the things that minority communities use regularly to pay bills, like cell phones or utility rates or things of that nature, aren't included in the FICO score that determines credit score. And so they don't rate as high when they have to go to a bank or someplace else. And so they get charged more interest, or they have to pay more for mortgage insurance. So that's why those industries have got to get engaged and help us make the changes that are needed. The real estate industry has got to address the very issue you talked about how they show houses. And that was one of the things I was alluding to when I talked about I have a dog in this fight, because I went to look at a home in Scottsville, Virginia, which was on the market, and we met everything, all the requirements. And when we showed up to have the house, to take a look at the house, and the person opened the door and looked out and saw me and my family standing out there waiting to look at it, all of a sudden the house was taken off the market. And they said, okay, no, we're not doing that. That is all about being able to have realtors show people houses on an equal basis. And that means the real estate industry's got to take the leadership. They've got to be at the table, and they've got to be advocates for exactly the same things you talked about. And that's in Fairfax. We've got this one Fairfax plan that I think lays the foundation for us to start to address those kinds of issues. But we've got to be aggressive. This is not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen without shaking things up a little bit. And that's why I'm saying the NAACP has got an excellent record in bringing these issues to the forefront and getting people organized and speaking out. But the fact is, we need to have more people standing with us. That's why I keep going back to the business community. The Arlington chapter or the Arlington Chamber of Commerce needs to be standing next to you when you go talk to your legislators to say this is an important issue. And the same thing in Fairfax with the Northern Virginia Chamber.
And I have a follow-up. Do you think that approaching the lenders and the real estate people with education and persuasion is the best route? Or do you think in cases where they are finding discrimination and testing that there should be some enforcement, some prosecution, some lawsuits?
Yes, I think we need to enforce the law. We need to go after them, but we also need to say there's a financial benefit to you if you do this, because we're creating more people able to buy these homes and give you more real estate commissions. If you got people that got money in their pocket and buy these homes, you've got a vested interest. That's why I keep going back. The one color that nobody discriminates against is green. And if we put that argument forth, that helps strengthen it. But you do have to enforce the law and take action when people are taking steps that are inconsistent with the values of this country.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Mayor, for that question. Next, we have John Ware.
Hi, thanks for putting on the program and all the hard work you guys have put in on this. I had a question about, and hoping you could comment a little bit on what seems to be a bit of tension between two of the local recommendations. And that's one in promoting home ownership opportunities for wealth. And then the second, promoting missing middle housing, which tends to take housing, single family housing, which is predominantly owner occupied, and the lower end, lower cost housing, which is more likely to be owned by Blacks, Hispanics, minorities, and converting that to multifamily housing, which statistically skews to be the mirror side of that, more rental opportunities. So in the communities you've studied, and from your own experience, what can be done to help mitigate the potential loss of homeownership among existing Black residents, and what can be used to help promote it in a missing middle program?
Matt, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and thank you for it. And Jim, I'll have you jump in as well. You know, I think you raised a good point about missing middles. You know, when Arlington County is considering adopting missing middle in December, they're not going to mandate any of these units are going to be home ownership, right? I mean, the property owner may decide to make them rental, some may be ownership. And really at the end of the day, you know, there's such a huge gap between supply and demand here. It's going to be hard to really drive down the prices of homes in Arlington in such a way that people who haven't had access to home ownership will immediately be able to buy, you know, any unit they want, right? But you know, in terms of displacement, that's a very good question. I don't know, Jim, if you have any thoughts on that. But yeah, I haven't really seen anything. Sorry, dog. I haven't really seen anything in any places we looked at to really address that directly, other than Seattle, which in their comprehensive plan update, this is in the appendix of a report, they looked at a number of factors to put together a risk displacement score. And they looked at a number of factors like you know, school quality and proximity to you know, expensive development, things like that. So look at their map. I think it's in the very bottom of our report, and it shows the criteria they used in the things they were considering when they were trying to figure out the impact of any sort of future development on impacted communities.
Yeah, well, in this section where we talk about the enhanced ownership efforts. I think it gets to looking at land trusts and things of that nature, some creative ways of making it easier for people to even if they start out renting, have the option to buy, and that we have support there. And I think the philanthropic community can help a little bit. You see some of the foundations around that are trying to create programs that would support efforts like that. But we need to look for some creative ways, as you said, of making sure that we're not moving people out or replacing people with some of these efforts, and to try to make sure that those people who need assistance get the leg up that they need in order to have some home ownership, or at least to begin to build a stake to do that. But once again, it gets back to the point, it's not just the land use people, it's everybody's got to be involved in finding these solutions and being creative.
And I wanted to add to that too, just some of our local efforts with the Arlington NAACP. So we've been pushing the county, after Missy Middle is adopted in whatever form it ends up being adopted, to ensure that they do provide more support for attainable home ownership, which would include land acquisition for community land trusts, looking at first generation home buyer assistance, just expanding the focus and attention and resources available for home ownership assistance, especially for moderate income, residents of color who previously been excluded from those housing markets because of pricing. So we think that the county has a really important role to play that previously they have not played in trying to expand home ownership assistance. The programs that we have in place today are relatively small, and they're helpful for the few people that they help each year, but it's a handful of residents who are helped through our programs. And we would really like to see the state also step up their support for attainable home ownership, especially for residents who historically have been excluded from the housing market.
Yeah, can I add one little point to that? That's why it goes back to the first recommendation that that Matt alluded to on the state level, is that if we require every comprehensive plan to include keeping a measure of what we're doing to address the equality issue and hold people accountable, because when you get right down to it, if you're not holding people accountable, you're not going to see progress. So the state's going to have to step up and take a leadership role in doing that. Some of the localities are starting to do it, but the state needs to drive this effort to say, we will keep score on what you're doing to address this issue of equity in housing and hold people accountable.
I just want to pop in. The state is doing, first, I agree with everything you said, Jim. Mm-hmm. The state has got a couple of pilot projects where we're funneling money for affordable home ownership, right, and we're targeting it on communities that have had traditionally large percentages of rental constituents, and also they've been communities that have been economically challenged. So we'll see. Hopefully we'll learn something, and in the tools we can share with other parts of the state.
My good friend, Senator Favola, thank you for raising that. And I know we can count on you to fight on these things. You've been doing a terrific job, and we appreciate your listening in on this. And we're ready to work with you in Richmond, because this is too important for us not to address it. And I think you would appreciate the reference to the fact that this is great for not only those who've been discriminated against traditionally, but it's going to benefit everybody across the board if we do it right.
Yes, and they do have studies that demonstrate that, but you are absolutely right. So thank you, Kellen. I hated to interrupt, but go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. And so next question, we have Adam Theo.
Hey, everyone. Great seminar. Honestly, Kellen, you answered most of my question already. So my question will have a little bit more specific. So, Mr. Dyke, you mentioned earlier the distinction between attainable housing and affordable housing. It's a distinction I agree with and really like. With the missing middle framework that Arlington County is working on right now, it really just deals with attainable housing, market rate housing, either rental or ownership. Are you aware of any programs from outside of Virginia, from other states, other jurisdictions, that Arlington or Virginia may be able to sort of co-opt or import that could deal with specifically the affordable housing side of things, committed affordable housing, whether rental or ownership, on top of the market rate attainable missing middle that we're working on right now.
Yo, Matt, you want to speak to that one?
Yeah, I'll have to look into a little more detail, but I know, Minneapolis, Portland, other locales like that have really been at the forefront of affordable housing and changes of zoning. So I could follow up with you on specifics there, but yeah, I agree with you. There are two different sides to this. There's attainable housing, but also recognizing that we need plenty of rental housing as well that's affordable. So we could take a closer look. I think the issue with that is a lot of the more affordable housing is attained through subsidized housing, right? So in Virginia, we use what's called the low income housing tax credit, which is mostly a competitive grant from the state that allows for, APA and AHC to build their projects really. And it's just really hard to have enough money to make those, make a lot of those projects in Virginia. So happy to follow up, but I know Portland and Minneapolis are really at the forefront of a lot of that.
Yeah, and one other thing is this report does not contain answers to everything, but that's one of the reasons why we put it out there, was to stimulate some discussion and to get some areas that we also need to add to focus on. So ideas, exploring ideas like what you just raised, and looking for other examples, looking for the fact that other people in other areas of the country are doing things that we could use here in Virginia. Hopefully that'll be a result of having forums like this so that we exchange ideas, stimulate new thoughts, and we can create a broader agenda to address these things. So keep those ideas going, and we'll try our best to follow up on them.
Well, thank you, Matt and Jim. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I really appreciate all of the thoughts that you provided us with to think about, and sort of the call to action for all of us within the NAACP, but also within the community and across the Commonwealth to fight harder for attainable home ownership, and to integrate our communities and undo the wrongs of the past in the best way that we can, to ensure that we have a more equitable society moving forward. I just wanted to turn it over to Brian Coleman, the Vice Chair of our Housing Committee for the Arlington NAACP, for final remarks before we end our program.
And could I say one thing before you close it out? Is to thank you again for providing the forum for us. And I know this organization is one that has a history of getting things done. I'm standing here now on the shoulders of the work of the NAACP over the centuries. And so I know you can get this done, and anything we can do to help you and support your efforts, please feel free to follow up with us, because we want to see this get done. So thank you for providing this opportunity.
Jim.
All
Well
right.
said, Jim.
First off, thank you, Matt and Jane, for just doing so much in this space and being willing to come and speak with us. It was really inspiring, not only to hear your own personal stories, but also just the breadth and depth really of the information that was presented. I think is extremely useful for many who know that this is an extremely morally fraught and difficult issue to deal with, but don't know where to begin because the issue runs so deep. So I really appreciate you just coming and speaking to us first. And for those who are just really passionate about this subject, I'd really appreciate if you'd be willing to just join with us in the NAACP to serve in whatever way you can, whether it's just volunteering some of your time, because really any time you give towards this is useful. And it doesn't matter if you are extremely knowledgeable or not, because what really matters is that you care deeply about this subject and you care deeply about people having the basic human right of housing. And so I'm really appreciative for everyone who came out tonight just for spending some time with us and learning more about this subject. So I know I did.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great rest of your night. And thank you again to our speakers and all of our attendees.
Okay, thank you very much. And good luck tomorrow night, Barbara, on your fundraiser for some great congressional candidates. So I know will help us on this issue.